Welcome back to the Make Heaven Crowded podcast. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into Genesis chapter 8.
Oh,
A
yeah.
chapter just full of symbolism and theological weight.
Right.
It picks up right after that devastating flood.
Yeah.
And it's so fascinating how it portrays this incredible sense of hope and restoration and a new beginning for both humanity and the earth.
Yeah, it's really interesting how it echoes themes we see like earlier in Genesis, like the creation account and the idea of God making covenants with humanity.
Right.
It's not just about the floodwaters receding, it's about God's faithfulness and this promise of a world reborn.
I like that, a world reborn. Okay, so let's unpack this verse by verse.
Yeah.
Genesis 8.1 starts with, "And God remembered Noah, and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged." What's the significance of God remembering Noah? Seems like an odd way to phrase it.
It is a powerful way to describe God's active intervention. It doesn't mean God literally forgot about Noah.
Right.
It's more about God initiating action.
Yeah.
Stepping in to deliver Noah and all the creatures on the ark.
Right.
It's similar to how God remembered Israel and Egypt,
Oh,
leading to their exodus.
Yeah.
This act of remembering highlights God's commitment to fulfilling his promises.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just a passive memory. It's God taking action.
Yeah.
So in verse 2, it says, "The fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained."
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
God literally turns off the forces of judgment.
Exactly. It really showcases God's complete control over nature.
Right.
He brings both judgment and restoration, just like we see with Job,
Yeah.
when God questions him about who controls the sea and its boundaries.
Moving on to verses 3 and 4. "And the waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of the 150 days the waters were abated, and the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat." It's interesting how the receding waters mirror the separation of waters we see back in Genesis 1 during the creation account.
Absolutely. It emphasizes this idea of renewal.
Yeah.
Like a new creation is unfolding. It's almost like a reset button is being hit on creation.
And then you have the ark coming to rest on the mountains of Ararat.
Right.
There's some interesting symbolism there too, right?
The ark shielding Noah from judgment becomes this powerful metaphor for salvation.
Right.
It wasn't just about physical survival.
Yeah.
It represents finding refuge in God amidst a world consumed by sin. And you're right, the mountains themselves could be seen as representing a place of safety and refuge.
Okay, so skipping ahead to verses 6 through 14, we see Noah sending out birds. First a raven, then a dove.
Okay.
What's with the different birds? Why not just send one?
The contrast between the raven and the dove is really striking.
Yeah.
The raven, often associated with death and decay, doesn't come back.
Okay.
It's a scavenger, kind of representing the old world, the one consumed by sin and judgment. But the dove, a symbol of peace and purity, returns, even bringing back an olive leaf.
It's like a tangible sign of hope.
Yeah.
And we see doves appearing again later in Scripture, particularly with Jesus.
That's a great observation. It's fascinating how this image bridges the Old and New Testaments.
Yeah.
The dove not only symbolizes peace, but also hints at the Holy Spirit.
Then in verses 13 and 14, we see that the earth is finally dry.
Okay.
It's a clean slate, a chance to start again. God then tells Noah in verses 15 through 17 to go forth, be fruitful, and multiply, which seems to echo the very first command given to Adam back in Genesis 1.28.
It's like we're seeing a new Eden, a second chance for humanity to live in harmony with God and creation. And Noah, in a way, becomes a new Adam given a fresh start.
Right.
It really underscores the idea of God's grace and his desire for restoration.
And it's not just about humans. Starting over, all the animals are included too,
Right.
right? They all go forth from the ark.
Absolutely. Verses 18 and 19 show that God's plan for renewal includes the whole creation. It speaks to the interconnectedness of all living things, and it's a reminder that God cares for his creation and desires its flourishing.
We've reached verse 20, and I think this is where things get really interesting. Noah builds an altar to the Lord and offers burnt offerings. This is the first time we see this kind of sacrificial ritual in the Bible, right?
You're right, this is a significant moment. It introduces this idea of atonement, the need to offer something to God in response to sin and judgment. It also sets the stage for the sacrificial system that will become central to the Old Testament and ultimately point towards the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus.
So this act of sacrifice isn't just about appeasing an angry God. It's about acknowledging the consequences of sin and seeking reconciliation with God.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our need for God's grace and mercy. And it's fascinating how this early account in Genesis sets the stage for understanding the deeper meaning of sacrifice that unfolds throughout the Bible.
In verse 21, we read that the Lord smelled a sweet savor from Noah's offering. It speaks to God's pleasure in Noah's act of worship,
Right.
but it's what follows that statement that I find particularly thought-provoking.
You mean God's promise to never again destroy the earth with a flood?
Exactly. God makes a covenant promising to never again wipe out all life with a flood, and he gives a reason. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Even knowing the wickedness of humanity, God chooses to show mercy and sustain creation. It's a powerful testament to his grace and faithfulness.
It really is a remarkable statement. It reveals so much about God's character, his love for his creation, and his willingness to forgive.
And this promise is further emphasized in verse 22. While the earth remaineth seed time and harvest and cold and heat and summer and winter and day and night shall not cease. It's like God is setting up these natural cycles as a guarantee of his faithfulness.
Absolutely. It's a declaration of God's commitment to upholding the natural order, to sustaining the rhythms of life. It's a source of comfort knowing that these cycles will continue, that the world won't be plunged back into chaos.
It makes me think about how we often worry about the future, about climate change and the fate of our planet. But this verse offers a sense of reassurance. God is in control, and he will sustain his creation.
It's a powerful reminder, especially in times of uncertainty and anxiety. God's promise stands firm regardless of the challenges we face.
So we've covered the whole chapter, unpacking each verse and exploring its significance. What would you say are the key takeaways from Genesis 8? What do you hope our listeners will grasp?
Well, I think one of the most crucial takeaways is this beautiful picture of God's faithfulness. He remembers his promises even in the face of human sin and rebellion. He doesn't abandon his people, and he remains committed to restoring his creation.
It's a message of hope and renewal. Even after a time of great devastation, it reminds us that God is always at work, bringing good out of difficult situations.
And it's not just a message for ancient times, it speaks to our lives today. We all face storms, challenges, and moments of despair, but Genesis 8 reminds us that God is with us, that he will see us through, and that he offers hope for a new beginning.
I love how this chapter echoes the creation account, emphasizing the idea of a world reborn. It's not just about the floodwaters receding. It's about God's creative power and his desire to make all things new.
Right, and it's not just a physical renewal. It points to a deeper spiritual transformation, a restoration of our relationship with God. It's a reminder that even when we feel lost and broken, God can make us whole again.
Speaking of restoration, the whole concept of atonement is introduced in this chapter, with Noah offering a sacrifice to God. It's a foreshadowing of the sacrifice that Jesus would ultimately make for us, the ultimate act of love and reconciliation.
Exactly. It lays the groundwork for understanding the depth of God's love for us and the lengths he was willing to go to restore our relationship with him. It's a message that resonates throughout the entire Bible, culminating in the person and work of Jesus Christ.
And it's a message that we all need to hear, regardless of our background or beliefs. We all need forgiveness. We all need a new beginning. And Genesis 8 points us to the source of that hope and renewal.
It's a reminder that no matter how far we've strayed from God, he is always waiting to welcome us back with open arms.
So as we reflect on Genesis chapter 8, what stands out to you the most? What has resonated with you on a personal level?
For me, it's the image of the dove returning to the ark with an olive leaf. It's such a simple yet profound symbol of hope and peace. It's a reminder that even in the midst of chaos and uncertainty, God is at work bringing forth beauty and renewal.
I love that it's a visual that sticks with you. A
Yeah.
reminder that God's grace is always present, even when we can't see it.
And it speaks to the idea that even small signs of hope can make a big difference.
Right.
We may not always see the full picture of God's plan, but we can trust that he is working all things together for good.
It's a powerful thought to hold on to, especially in times of difficulty.
And it's a thought that can inspire us to be agents of hope and renewal in our own lives and in the world around us.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Genesis 8, what are some practical takeaways for our listeners? How can understanding this ancient story impact our lives today?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is the reminder that God is faithful. He keeps his promises even when we mess up, and he offers us a way back to him no matter how far we've strayed.
It's a message of hope and forgiveness, which is something we all need, right?
Absolutely. We all make mistakes. We all fall short, but God's grace is always available to us.
And Genesis 8 shows us that God's grace isn't just about individual forgiveness. It's about restoring the whole creation, making all things new.
It's a cosmic renewal, a vision of hope that extends beyond our personal lives to encompass the entire world.
It's inspiring, isn't it? To to think that God is working to restore not just our hearts, but the whole world.
It certainly gives me hope for the future, even in the face of all the challenges we see in the world today.
Me too. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into Genesis 8. We've explored its historical context, its theological significance, and its personal implications for our lives today.
And we've seen how this ancient story continues to speak to us, offering timeless truths and profound insights into God's character and his plan for the world.
Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. We've talked about God's promise to never again destroy the earth with a flood. But the Bible also talks about a final judgment, the time when God will make all things right. How do those two ideas fit together? How can we reconcile the promise of God's faithfulness with the reality of judgment?
That's a deep question and one that we could spend a lot of time unpacking. But I think the key is to remember that God's judgment is always motivated by love. It's not about punishment for its own sake, but about purifying and restoring his creation.
So even in judgment, there's a sense of hope, a promise of renewal.
Exactly. And ultimately, God's desire is to restore all things, to bring about a new heaven and a new earth where there will be no more pain, no more suffering, and no more death.
That's a beautiful vision, and one that gives us hope as we navigate the complexities and challenges of life in this world.
It's a reminder that our ultimate hope is not in this world, but in the world to come, the world that God has promised to create.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Genesis chapter 8. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope it's left you with a renewed sense of wonder and hope.
It's been a pleasure exploring this chapter with you.
And until next time, may you be filled with the peace and hope that comes from knowing the God who remembers, restores, and renews.